Hello guys and welcome to the 11th episode of my series about Italian presidents, where I also talk about what was happening in Italy at the time. Last time we talked about Ciampi, the president who taught the nation to be patriotic as an Italian and as a European. I got some good news and bad news. The good news is that I will be able to also talk about the events involving Napolitano after 2010, unlike I announced in the first episode. This was possible thanks to the lessons of my professor Alessandro Giaccone. The bad news is, however, that this will be the last episode of the series, since we run out of presidents. In 2022, the current president of Italy, Sergio Mattarella, will be ending his term, so chances are I will be talking about him and perhaps whoever comes after him in a year or so, who knows. Giorgio Napolitano is arguably one of the most controversial presidents, not only for his multiple accusations of corruption in the 80s and 90s, but also for his heavily interventionist approach to the political shenanigans. Without further ado, let's get started with Giorgio Napolitano, the first president who was a former communist and the first to run for a second, although short, term as president of the Republic. Let's begin. Giorgio Napolitano was born in 1925 in Naples. From a very young age, he had a big passion for cinema and theater. However, his true vocation was law, which he studied at the University of Naples starting from 1942 onwards, a very complicated time. Two friends of his, Maurizio Barenson and Antonio Ghirelli, introduced him to politics by making him join a newspaper called 9 Maggio. There he encountered many communists. One in particular, Mario Alicata, convinced him to sign up to the Communist Party, which he admittedly joined without really knowing Marxist doctrine at first. His words, not mine. Despite his initial ignorance, he will find in the Communist Party two of his idols, Emilio Sereni and Giorgio Amendola, two of the most respected representatives of Italian communism. In 1946, after the referendum, which saw the end of the monarchy, Napolitano witnessed the PCI's headquarters in Naples being assaulted by some supporters of the monarchy, something not very nice to look at but expected since 75% of the inhabitants of Naples voted to keep the king around. In 1948, Napolitano became a functionary for the Communist Party. Then, in 1953, he was elected into the Chamber of Deputies, where he remained until 1996. Napolitano always remained true to his party, though his devotion to the ideology moderated over time. He was initially a follower of Togliatti, who was heavily influenced by the Soviets, but things did change. With the death of Togliatti, Luigi Longo became secretary of the PCI, and Napolitano will join his current when he started having second thoughts on the USSR alongside most of his party. In 1968, the Italian Communist Party was the first party of its kind in Europe to dissociate from the USSR. The event that brought Longo to make such a drastic decision was the invasion of the Red Army in Czechoslovakia, which they found uncalled for. Luigi Longo was a decent party secretary, but his successor, Berlinguer, really changed the party for the better by making the Italian Communist Party pro-Europe, pro-liberty, and most importantly, open to alliances with the center, in this case, Aldo Moro's DC. Napolitano, just like many communist voters at the time, found its ideological basis in Berlinguer, whose message and ideals he believes in to this very day. In 1978, Napolitano was chosen to go on a trip to the US to represent the PCI. He was reluctant to go at first, since this was during Aldo Moro's kidnapping. However, Berlinguer convinced him to do it anyway. His charm, eloquence, and fluency in English helped him win the attention and the respect of many American diplomats and academics, like Harvard professor Stanley Hoffman, who actually invited him to the US despite Kissinger's disapproval. Napolitano would break the ice between the US and the PCI. Even though the former were still opposed to their entry to an Italian cabinet, relations had improved significantly. However, in the 80s, when Napolitano had become one of the most important members of PCI, he started associating more to social democratic ideology, to the annoyance of Berlinguer. After Berlinguer's death in 1984, a certain Alessandro Natta would take his place. Napolitano will be chosen to be the leader of the communist deputies in parliament, where he tried to work together with the rest of the left. In 1986, Napolitano also became the official foreign representative of the Italian Communist Party. This allowed them to witness Gorbachev's failure to keep the USSR together. It was during his time as foreign representative that Napolitano had supposedly come across the source of the legitimate party funds that the Communist Party, together with all other parties in the First Republic, received throughout these years to finance their campaigns and activities. There is no concrete proof that he was aware of the mafia exchanges, although his ignorance seems unlikely due to his powerful position in the party. In 1991, the PCI became the Democratic Party of the Left, of which he remained part of when the Cold War had ended. 1992 was the year when Napolitano was elected president of the Chamber of Deputies, where he announced Scalfaro's nomination to the presidency of the Republic, and with him witnessed the mess that was Tangentopoli. In 1996, he won't be re-elected into parliament. However, Prodi will appoint him as Minister of Internal Affairs, his first time in a cabinet after almost 50 years in politics, and the first former communist to be appointed to such a role. In his time as minister, he will have to deal with the secessionist rallies by bosses Lega Nord and build the first immigration centers to keep the first refugees. In 1999, he also had a short 5-year-long career as president of the Commission of Constitutional Affairs in the European Union, where he fought for the implementation of the European Constitution alongside Ciampi that sadly, as we learned from Ciampi's episode, never came to be. Napolitano's political career, however, reached its peak when finally in 2006, with the support of Massimo D'Alema and Fausto Bertinotti, Napolitano was finally elected president of the Republic after 4 scrutinies. His election is deemed today a sign that Italy had moved on from the Cold War and was ready to acknowledge the merits of a former communist. However, Italy had now new problems to deal with. 2006 was a messy year. It was also the year when the most polarizing parliamentary elections took place. It was unique as well, with all parties being united into 2 main alliances, kind of like an American presidential election. The 2 main candidates were Silvio Berlusconi with his House of Liberty alliance composed of Forza Italia, Alleanza Nazionale and Lega Nord, as well as other smaller parties. On the other side of the ring we had Romano Prodi. His alliance was called the Union, and its main parties were l'Ulivo, the Communist Refundation Party, the Greens, Italy of Values, Rose on the Fist, a socialist party, the Radicals, and Italian Communists. The election results showed a very narrow, although existing, victory of the left, though thanks to the newly made electoral law called Legge Calderoli, named after Senator Roberto Calderoli from Lega Nord, the majority award was reintroduced, allowing Prodi to gain a solid majority in the Chamber of Deputies. Unfortunately, the Senate's majority was a little weaker. This was because the Senate seats were assigned according to a regional system, so Prodi got significantly less votes than in the chamber, and so his vote of confidence entirely relied upon the senators for life, who are nominated by the President of the Republic. The Calderoli law was nicknamed Porcellum, which reminds us of the Italian word for pork. Experts will tell you that the name Porcellum refers to the sketchy nature of the law, which, spoiler alert, will later be deemed unconstitutional and undemocratic. But I like to think that it was called like that because Calderoli is fat. Prodi's second cabinet lasted 2 years, which is pretty good when you consider Bertinotti's communists and Mastella's centrists were hard to appease. As all this was going on, Napolitano was elected with 53.8% of the votes, which was just a few votes away from Segni's percentages, the lowest in the history of the Republic. Napolitano initially intended to continue Ciampi's legacy of non-interventionism, but his term will be plagued by a series of weak parliaments without a political majority. When facing such polarized and divided parliament, he often encouraged the 2 parts to dialogue and to come together, but it wasn't very successful, and for that reason he will have no no choice but to be a lot more interventionist than he wanted to. In February 2007, Prodi suggested the idea to pass a law in parliament regarding gay weddings. It passed in the Chamber of Deputies but didn't in the Senate, leading to drama. As all this was going on, former mayor of Rome, Walter Veltroni, founded a new Democratic Party. Some members of the parliament joined in, making Prodi's majority weaker than it already was. Then, while Prodi was pushing for the reorganization of the state coffers, Veltroni pushed for the lowering of taxes, which was counterproductive. The last drop was when Minister of Justice Mastella resigned after receiving some allegations of corruption, though nothing came of it. Prodi tried again to win the vote of confidence with a new cabinet he made, but without much success. Then Napolitano instructed Franco Marini, president of the Senate, to build a new cabinet, but sadly he couldn't convince the right to support him either, and therefore Napolitano had no choice but to call for a new election, where the right-wing coalition won this time, and Berlusconi built his fourth cabinet, although with a much weaker majority than its earlier years, though it was much stronger than Prodi's. Berlusconi's new and last cabinet was not immune to the new flaws of the parliament and its instability when it came to getting a majority. Berlusconi's victory was in large part due to the union between Alleanza Nazionale and Forza Italia, which named itself Popolo della Libertà, the people of freedom. The English version sounds even more populist. In this party we see a lot of people that you might remember from Italian Politician of the Week. Other than Berlusconi, we have for example Giorgio Meloni, Alessandra Mussolini, Maria Stella Gelmini and Umberto Bossi, but also some other people I mentioned here and there, like Ignazio La Russa, Angelino Alfano, Mara Carfagna, Luca Zaia, and the list goes on. Berlusconi did a lot of redeeming things in the cabinet. For example, when Abruzzo suffered a big earthquake in 2008, he moved the G8 summits in Aquila in order to increase awareness of the tragedy. Minister of Education and Research Maria Stella Gelmini, despite reforms on public schools that Napolitano himself referred to as poorly written, passed a series of less talked about but generally seen as overly positive reforms on university and research, not to mention the numerous financial laws that the parliament was able to pass in order to reduce public spending. Then, in April 2010, Berlusconi and Fini of Alleanza Nazionale had a falling out after a big public argument. Fini, along some of his supporters, broke away from Alleanza Nazionale. Initially, they were still formally allied with Berlusconi, but in November they joined the opposition and started a motion of no confidence against the cabinet, aiming to make it fall. In December, the vote was made and Berlusconi fell through, although it was a narrow victory that was owed to 3 deserters from the opposition. One of them was Antonio Razzi, a member of Italy of Values, who later joined Forza Italia and became a senator in 2013. As all this was going on, Napolitano applied moral suasion on Berlusconi regarding many of his proposals. Not only that, but he sent back a law in regard to work-related accidents, which will pass after some edits. He also refused to sign one decree involving the young woman Eluana Englaro, which was in a vegetative state after a terrible car accident. The decree would have made it illegal for a short while for the doctors to pull the plug, but Napolitano refused to sign it since he found it too compulsive and that a better law should be made about the subject. Englaro will die on her own sometime later. Another law that Napolitano had somewhat of a role in was a law that would make the President of the Republic, President of the Council of Ministers, President of the Chamber of Deputies, and the President of the Senate immune to allegation of all sorts, except treason of course. Napolitano was reluctant, but he expected this from Berlusconi nonetheless. I think Berlusconi realized that his cabinet was in a precarious position and wanted to make sure the left didn't try to force him to resign by involving him in the law, like it had already happened before. The law passed in 2009, but it was deemed unconstitutional sometime later by the Constitutional Court. This was called by journalist Lodo Schifani. Lodo means award or eulogy. Schifani, it means disgusting. So the disgusting award, I guess? Italian journalists are so creative. 2011 was a very interesting year for the world. On one hand, it was Italy's 150th birthday. On the other hand, the Arab Spring took place. Italy was particularly involved in Libya and the whole Benghazi crisis. Berlusconi, contrary to the Iraq war a few years prior, didn't want to send the army there because he had good ties with Gaddafi and they had agreed on no military intervention. Napolitano and Minister of Defense Ignazio La Russa, however, convinced them of the importance of Italy's contribution to the UN's and NATO's peace mission, because it would have led to a tragedy in Benghazi if they hadn't, not to mention the refugee crisis that could come later on. The NATO intervention will last about 6 months, and at the end of it, Gaddafi was killed in rather mysterious circumstances. To top it all off, 2011 is also the year when Greece went bankrupt, and its economic crisis impacted many other European countries. Italy was one of them. Italy reached incredibly high levels of spread, and Berlusconi will be encouraged by the EU to introduce a new tax called IMU to fight it, which basically taxed building properties. Despite Berlusconi's cooperation with the EU, Napolitano instrumentalized his failure by encouraging people to put Berlusconi aside. It was then that the centrist member of the right-wing coalition broke up with Berlusconi, leading to the end of his fourth and last cabinet. The end of Berlusconi's fourth cabinet is in many ways the first cabinet to fall due to the effects of globalization. Despite being the result of an overwhelming electoral victory, the institutional shenanigans, the European interventions, and the economic situation persuaded the state to get rid of Berlusconi and not the people. For that reason, Monti and Napolitano are perceived awfully by the public, since they had in many ways indirectly questioned the results of a public election and just did what they wanted. Despite its many flaws, Italians wanted Berlusconi to stay there. This was one of the most crucial events of the Second Republic, and in many ways was also what started the new wave of popular skepticism, amplified by the internet and later on tamed by a certain political force. Napolitano initially wanted to place Bersani, head of the Democratic Party, in charge of the new left-wing cabinet. However, when that turned out an impossible feat, he went for a government of national unity. To succeed Berlusconi will be the independent politician and senator for life Mario Monti, who after easily winning the parliament's confidence applied many austerity measures that halved the spread. Minister of Economics Elsa Fornero applied the Fornero Law that essentially increased pension age from 62 to 67. It was harsh but necessary economically. Despite his best efforts, Monti will never match Ciampi in popularity, mostly because he was seen as a European puppet. But that is a can of worms I already opened in my old video on Monti, link in the description. Napolitano was also heavily criticized at the time for the appointment of Monti that was clearly planned ahead, and many would go as far to say that he also had planned for his eventual failure. Monti was in power from 2011 to 2013, until Forza Italia retracted its vote of confidence shortly before the election. It really didn't matter that much. The elections were supposed to take place in April that year. Instead, they had them in February, and they were interesting. The Democratic Party and the center-right coalition reached a draw, which isn't surprising at this point until you look at the percentages. 30% each. So what happened to the other 40? Well, 10% was won by Monti's alliance, probably because he wanted to finish what he had already started. But then we go further down and... No. For the ones who don't know, the Five Star Movement is an anti-establishment party founded by comedian Beppe Grillo, and all it does is bring chaos to the Italian institutions because it's full of people who don't know how it works. They are the certain political forces I was talking about earlier. Check out the video above if you want to see more, and below. As I was saying, the parliament was not in the best state. This made it hard for Napolitano to choose a prime minister. At first he tried to go for for Bersani again, but he couldn't be voted in, and so he went for Enrico Letta, who continued Monti's austerity, though his cabinet doesn't have Monti's bad reputation, quite the contrary. In fact, Letta was recently appointed Secretary of PD, although many see his cabinet as a lost opportunity that ended too early. As this was going on, the parliament was talking about the new president of the republic to elect. The Democratic Party was split in two at the time, the people that supported liberal Matteo Renzi and the Social Democrats that supported Bersani, so it was pretty hard to come to an agreement among them. The Five-Star Movement nominated a certain Stefano Rodota, a well-respected jurist, to the presidency of the republic. Other candidates floating around were Martellema, Prodi and Mattarella. Since the scrutinies were going nowhere, Berlusconi, Bersani and Monti went to the Quirinale and asked Napolitano to run for president again. He was reluctant at first since he was getting old, but he decided to appease his colleagues and remained in power until 2015, after winning the elections with 73% of the votes. In his re-entry speech, he criticized the parliament for not passing any social reforms and for failing to come up with decent compromises. Letta was in many ways the reflection and result of that speech. In 2013, Renzi became secretary of the Democratic Party, and after reassuring Enrico that he had no intention to take his place as president, he took his place as president. The way he bamboozled them was by making an alliance with Berlusconi, who suddenly decided to withdraw Forza Italia's vote of confidence, which then led to Letta's resignation and the formation of Renzi's cabinet, which lasted from 2014 to 2016. Renzi's cabinet was inherently liberal and actually did a lot of good things for the economy that can be comparable to Craxi's, minus the deficit and the corruption. Well, almost. Though I'm not allowed to talk about this because most of Renzi's government doesn't involve Napolitano at all. In the beginning of 2015, Napolitano, after turning 90 years old, decided to resign. At the presidential election that same year, Sergio Mattarella was, according to many, the most likely successor, but he didn't candidate at first. The first few names to gain attention were Emma Bonino, Stefano Rodotà again, and Ferdinando Impositato, another Italian jurist. However, what I find hilarious is that among these potential candidates was also Vittorio Veltroni. Among his supporters was Giorgia Meloni alongside the rest of Fratelli d'Italia. I made a video about Veltroni previously. He is the head of the newspaper Libero and he is famous for his grumpy appearances on Italian TV. He is a man full of prejudice and he is too old to give a shit and doesn't have any filters. His video will also be in the description. Matteo Renzi eventually convinced Mattarella to run, and on January 31st he was elected with 66% of the votes at the fourth scrutiny. Napolitano is still alive and is currently a senator for life, though due to his old age hasn't really done much. He is currently the oldest member of the Senate and is turning 96 in late June. Mattarella is still president and, as I said before, his term will end next year. So far he was president of the Republic over Renzi until 2016, then Paolo Gentiloni until the 2018 elections. Gentiloni is a member of PD that shared views with Bersani and Renzi's factions, and he is the one that famously handled the migrant crisis thanks to the interior minister Minniti. If we reach 25 likes, I will cover it in a future video. After the 2018 election, the Five-Star Movement became Italy's biggest party, and Giuseppe Conte was chosen in order to find a balance between Lega and the Five-Star in a whole new cabinet. Due to the Five-Star's rise being attributed to internet populism, many argue that 2018 marks the end of the Second Republic and the beginning of the Third Republic, where social media plays an enormous role. Though I have to stress this terminology is not adopted by the historians as much as journalists, so take these labels with a grain of salt. On the 26th of January 2021, Conte resigned from his second cabinet, which lasted from August 2019 up until then. Draghi is our new prime minister and so far he seems to be doing pretty well, although it's too early to tell for sure. Well guys, this is the end of the series. I took you through the history of the Republic of Italy from the Second World War up until today, and it was incredible. I'm not exaggerating. I want to thank you all for sticking by and for watching my documentaries. I knew that 2021 was going to be a different year for my channel, but I didn't think it would be so revolutionary. Making these videos has made me want to know more about the people that were part of the history of my country, as well as the history of our institutions. For this reason, I decided to dedicate my channel exclusively to Italian Republican history and politics. It's a niche topic, but God, I love niches, and I love this one in particular. I hope you are enjoying Italian Politician of the Week, as well as any other video I plan to cover in the near future. Thanks again for watching. I will see you next time.